You can see it in his posture, in his ease of movement, in the way his shoulders no longer carry the weight of constant explanation, because this version of Prince Harry does not look like a man driven by anger or bitterness, as the tabloids so often insist. He looks lighter, freer, grounded in a calm that doesn't perform and doesn't beg for approval, the kind of peace that doesn't need an apology, and that is precisely what unsettles sections of the UK media, who built entire narratives on the expectation that he would fail once he stepped outside the rigid framework of royal life. Yet years later, he stands as a living contradiction to their predictions, walking, speaking, and existing, with a quiet confidence that suggests relief rather than regret. Because happiness does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it appears in the absence of tension, in the relaxed posture of someone no longer bracing for impact. And Harry's body language speaks volumes in ways headlines cannot erase. Despite relentless criticism, mockery, and attempts to frame his choices as reckless or disloyal, he appears emotionally lighter, as though the constant internal conflict of trying to exist within an institution that demanded silence at the cost of mental health has finally eased. And this calm is not performative or strategic. It is the visible byproduct of a man who chose self-preservation over approval, a decision the British tabloids still seem unable to forgive. What is striking is how often critics confuse peace with arrogance, as if a man smiling more freely, laughing more openly, and moving through the world without visible tension must somehow be pretending. Yet anyone who has lived under prolonged scrutiny knows that real anger hardens the face and stiffens the body, while relief softens it, and Harry looks softened by relief, not inflamed by resentment. The UK media has long relied on caricatures, casting him alternately as the rebellious spare, the troubled prince, the irresponsible son, and later the manipulated husband, because complexity does not sell as easily as condemnation. But those labels crumble when confronted with the simple reality of a man who appears happier than he ever did when he was fulfilling expectations at the expense of himself. Happiness, especially male happiness rooted in emotional honesty, makes people uncomfortable, particularly when it disrupts deeply ingrained hierarchies. And Harry's visible ease challenges the long-held idea that fulfillment only exists within royal duty, suggesting instead that autonomy and emotional safety can be more powerful than titles or proximity to the crown. Critics often insist that he must be miserable because they need him to be miserable for their narrative to hold, yet misery has a look and sound of its own, and what Harry projects now is steadiness, clarity, and a grounded presence that comes from aligning one's outer life with one's inner values, something he repeatedly said he was unable to do before stepping away. It is telling that much of the anger directed at him seems to come not from concern, but from perceived defiance, because nothing provokes institutional resentment more than someone leaving and thriving, someone who refuses to collapse under the weight of expectation, and instead builds a life that looks visibly healthier. Harry's peace feels earned rather than curated, shaped by difficult conversations, therapy, grief processing, and the conscious decision to break cycles that had already cost him dearly, including the loss of his mother and years of emotional suppression. And when you understand that context, his lighter demeanour makes sense because healing often looks like a quiet reclaiming of self rather than a dramatic victory lap. The tabloids may frame his calm as smugness and his boundaries as hostility, but those interpretations say more about the observers than the observed, because peace does not owe anyone an explanation, and growth does not require permission from institutions that benefited from one's silence. What stands out most is that Harry no longer appears reactive. He does not seem to move from a place of needing to prove or defend himself constantly. And that lack of defensiveness is one of the clearest indicators of emotional freedom, since anger thrives on constant engagement, while peace is comfortable with disengagement. The media continues to provoke, speculate, and bait, yet his responses, when he chooses to give them, appear measured rather than explosive, reflective rather than impulsive, suggesting that the internal chaos once attributed to him may have been less about his nature and more about the environment he was trapped in. There is also a visible difference in how he inhabits his role as a husband and father. Not in staged perfection, but in relaxed presence, the kind that comes from feeling safe rather than scrutinized, and that safety seems to have given him permission to simply be, without constantly scanning for judgment or consequence. The insistence that he must be unhappy often feels like projection, a refusal to accept that stepping away from tradition can sometimes lead to a fuller life. Because if Harry is genuinely happier outside the institution, it raises uncomfortable questions about what that institution costs the people within it. His ease disrupts the moral authority of critics who framed duty as the ultimate virtue and sacrifice as the highest calling. Because here is a man who chose himself and did not unravel, who prioritized mental health and did not disappear, who spoke openly about pain and emerged steadier rather than broken. The peace he carries now feels rooted in self-acceptance rather than validation, and that kind of peace cannot be shaken by bad press because it was never built on praise to begin with. Observers who pay attention to the subtleties notice it in how he listens more than he reacts, how he allows silence without rushing to fill it, how he speaks with emotional clarity rather than defensive urgency, all signs of someone no longer living in survival mode. This is not to say his life is without challenges or criticism, but there is a difference between navigating difficulty from a place of stability and enduring it from a place of internal fracture, and Harry appears to have crossed that line into stability. The tabloids may continue to recycle old tropes and question his motives, but their narratives feel increasingly disconnected from the visual and emotional reality he presents, because you cannot convincingly sell misery when the subject looks at ease within himself. In the end, what unsettles critics most may not be his choices, his words, or even his departure, but the undeniable sense that he found peace without their permission, that he rebuilt his life on his own terms and looks better for it. And that kind of quiet happiness is deeply threatening to systems that rely on obedience, because it proves that freedom does not always come with regret. Sometimes it comes with relief, balance, and a softness that no headline can harden. The kind of peace that does not shout, does not argue, and does not apologize for existing.